Good evening, everyone. So today I would like to share with you how did I find out the external user input variables or passing in between the functions in Azure Durable Function Framework. So firstly, I would like to briefly mention about why do we use Azure Durable Function first is because it solves the problems of a long waiting process in Azure functions. Because for just regular Azure functions, if you have a really long processing task or process to do, usually it will have a timeout issue. But the Azure Durable function will solve this problem by implementing async framework in this setup. So firstly, we see that for Azure Durable function, it has three parts. So firstly, the trigger function will serve as the HTTP user trigger. So this is where you would be able to actually pass user input variables from URL, right? And then this trigger function, after accepting user external parameters, then it would actually launch an orchestrator function. And then after launching this orchestrator function, then this orchestrator will serve a role as a delegator, right? So then it would, inside this orchestrator function, then it would then start an activity function. So this activity function is actually the function that will be doing all the work, all the heavy lifting work, right? So there you go. You have three components in this Azure async durable function framework. But let's just take a look actually how the user input parameters gets passed in between these three different functions, right? So firstly, the user will be able to submit a parameter through the URL, right? Of the HTTP URL here that you see on the screen, right? So this is assuming that you actually deploy your Azure Durable function already onto the Azure cloud, right? So you see that the firstly after the HTTPS, you would have the Azure durable function name that you created on the Azure cloud already, right? So this says the app on Azure. And then after the API variable, then you would have an orchestrator. So this is like a default setting for Azure durable functions, but after the slash, this is inside this curly bracket is actually where you would be able to supply your um, orchestrator function name, right, as a user input. But then after the question mark is really where you would supply the values of the parameters that will be needed in the Azure durable functions, right? So you see here that I'm just using a generic name, which is param name. And then after you submit this, right? So inside this trigger function that you see on the screen, firstly, it starts with the async because this is actually implemented in the async framework. Um, so the first parameters is actually where you would accept the user input parameters, right? So here so this is how you would be able to retrieving the user input parameters. So firstly, the REQ, then you would address its attribute names such as route params, right? So then you would take the parameter name, orchestrator function name from the HTTP URL, right? You see on the screen, so which is the ones, right? And then this would actually define your orchestrator name. And then actually this orchestrator name inside the file structure. So this name that you assign to this orchestrator will be actually the name of the folder that contains your orchestrator. So the second one is actually where you would be able to retrieve the user input parameters. So here you see that all these parameters will be wrapped inside the dictionary, right? Python dictionary structure. So firstly, this param1 is a hard-coded variable name, right? But in fact, you will be able to actually call it any name that you want. But then this is actually a value that you would be able to retrieve from the HTTP URL as well, which you see on the screen that is marked as 2, right? So this is where you would actually pass the variable values from the URL into the function. But then just remember that you need to actually wrap all the parameters inside this dictionary. So, and then over here, we also give an example that you will be able to also pass the instance ID from the HTTP URL as well. Here we mark it as 3, right? So this is actually sometimes needed to launch your orchestrator function, but this is not always needed. So you see that this instance ID, it actually goes into the second parameters inside this launch start new function, right? But in reality, it's not always needed. You can always just put like a null object such as none. So therefore, you have some flexibility of implementing it. So after you get all these variables, right, and then you need to construct an object, which is called durable orchestration client object. So this is where you would actually launch an orchestrator function. So after you make this client, then the next line is going to actually launch the orchestrator function, right? So you always actually type await before you launch the orchestrator function. This is just like a syntax where you implement async function that you would always put the async keyword in the before the function definition, right? So here you would also always put await before you launch the orchestrator function. So we can take a look the parameters that you put in when launching this orchestrator function, new orchestrator function, right? So firstly, the first parameter is where you get, right, from the HTTP URL about the orchestrator function name, which is actually the name of the folder in your file structure that contains the orchestrator function. So the second parameter will be the instance ID that you get from the HTTP URL as well. But as we said, this second parameter is not always needed, right? And the third parameters is where you would actually supply all the user input variable values that you wrapped everything into a dictionary, right? Actually, if you don't really supply any user input value, that works as well. But then you will just put none in this third parameter, right? So after this line, then the next line will be a return statement. So this return statement in our implementation here, so this is just using the default setup on Azure website tutorial. So for this line, it will actually return a JSON object on the web page, right? Or you can call it the landing page of this Azure durable function trigger function. So it would contains a bunch of keys, right? All the keys, it would gives you this is just a way to query the status of your orchestrator or your activity function to see if like stuff are completed and also what are the outputs and all that. So then you just need to actually supply the REQ parameter and then also the instance ID for the return. So then we can also see that after you launch this orchestrator function, right? So then on this second panel, then the orchestrator function will start working. So you see that in the third parameters that you put in the start new function, this input dictionary would actually go pass into this context variable inside this orchestrator function definition, right? So this is where you would actually see the user input parameter values flow between the trigger function and orchestrator function, right? So after you pass in this input dictionary into this orchestrator function, the way that you would be able to retrieve it inside the function body is using the context get input function, right? So in this case, then the user input would actually get passed into this parameter values, right? So here it will be preserved as a dictionary's data structure, right? So therefore, if let's say that you'd assume that you actually pass in a bunch of parameter values, right? So you're just gonna actually address the keys inside this dictionary to retrieve all the parameter values, right? As here you see on the screen that because we actually just pass in one parameter value, so therefore we're just gonna retrieve our only parameter one value, and then you will be actually also pass this parameter one value to the activity function in the second parameter, right? So therefore, after you launch your orchestrator function inside the trigger function, then you will actually also launch the activity function inside the orchestrator function too, right? So therefore, you are just gonna retrieve all the individual values from the input dictionary, right? And then submit it into this activity function launcher, right? So therefore, then you will be able to return the result after the activity function completes. And then one thing to remember is that if you see that the first parameter, which is the variable name activity function, right? So this name will actually be also be the name that you assign to your folders that contain the activity function as well, right? So you see that now this parameter one actually will be get passed into this main function in the activity function folder, right? So the name, it just takes in the parameter one as the value to actually execute this main function for the activity function. So there you go. You actually see input parameters, how it flows in between all these three different functions and complete your data processing task. That's pretty much it. Thanks for your listening. That's it.